Long before Scotland became the nation we recognize today, a mysterious civilization thrived across its northern lands. Stretching from the shores of the Firth of Forth to the Moray Firth, these people built powerful kingdoms that lasted for nearly 6 centuries, from around the 3rd to the 9th century AD. Historians know them as the Picts. Yet despite generations of research, their true origins remained one of Britain's greatest archaeological mysteries. The earliest written mention of the Picts comes from Roman records dating to 297 AD. Roman authors referred to them as Picti, often translated as the painted people, because of stories that they decorated their bodies with striking designs. Living beyond the empire's northern frontier, they resisted repeated Roman campaigns and remained one of the few peoples Rome never fully conquered. As Roman influence faded, the Picts emerged as the dominant power across northern Scotland. They defended their territory against invading forces, challenged expanding Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and developed a remarkable artistic tradition, unlike anything else in medieval Britain. Their beautifully carved standing stones, decorated with mysterious symbols such as crescents, double discs, V-rods, intricate animals, and other unique designs, can still be found scattered across Scotland today, with hundreds surviving as silent reminders of their lost civilization. Yet sometime during the 9th century, the Picts seemed to disappear. Their kingdom gradually merged into the growing kingdom of Alba. Their language fell out of use, and over time, their separate identity faded into what would eventually become medieval Scotland. For historians, this raised a series of enduring questions. Who were the Picts before they became part of Scotland? Where had they originally come from? What language did they speak? And were they descendants of an older population or newcomers to the region? For more than 200 years, scholars debated these questions without reaching a clear answer. Competing theories were built from archaeology, medieval texts, and linguistic evidence, but none could fully explain the story. That uncertainty remained until a breakthrough arrived in 2023. An international team of researchers analyzed ancient DNA recovered from confirmed Pictish burials at 2 important archaeological sites in eastern and northern Scotland. Using advanced genetic sequencing, they reconstructed the ancestry of individuals who had lived during the height of the Pictish era. The findings challenged many long-standing assumptions and painted a far more complex picture than historians had expected. Instead of confirming the traditional theories, the genetic evidence revealed surprising connections between the Picts and surrounding populations of Iron Age and early medieval Britain. In a single peer-reviewed study, decades of speculation were replaced with measurable biological evidence, forcing researchers to reconsider one of Europe's most fascinating lost civilizations. The Picts were never mythical figures. They were real people who shaped the history of northern Britain for centuries. But modern science is only now beginning to reveal who they truly were. To understand why these DNA discoveries are so important, we first need to examine the clues the Picts left behind, and why those clues puzzled historians for so many generations. The Picts are one of the most documented and least understood peoples of early medieval Europe. They appear in Roman sources from the late 3rd century onward. They feature prominently in the historical writings of the Venerable Bede, whose 8th century ecclesiastical history of the English people provides one of the most detailed external accounts of Pictish society. They left behind king lists, carved stones, place names, and archaeological sites that have been studied continuously since the 18th century. And yet almost everything about them has been contested. The Roman accounts are hostile and fragmentary. Bede, writing from Northumbria in 731 AD, was describing a neighboring kingdom from an outsider's perspective. Music. The Pictish sources themselves, the king lists, and the few surviving inscriptions are terse and often difficult to interpret. The carved stones are spectacular but silent. Music. Over 350 symbol stones survive, scattered across eastern and northern Scotland. They are classified into 3 types. Class 1 stones are incised with symbols on undressed boulders and are generally pre-Christian. Class 2 stones feature relief carving with Christian imagery alongside traditional symbols. Class 3 stones have Christian imagery without the traditional Pictish symbols. The symbols themselves are remarkably consistent across time and geography. The crescent and V-rod appears on stones from Shetland to Fife. The double disc, the Pictish beast, the mirror and comb. The same motifs recur across centuries and hundreds of miles. This consistency suggests a unified symbolic system, a shared cultural vocabulary that extended across the entire Pictish Confederation. But what the symbols mean, no one knows. Various interpretations have been proposed. The symbols represent clan affiliations. They represent personal names. They represent religious concepts. They represent a writing system whose key has been lost. None of these interpretations has been definitively established. The symbols remain undeciphered, a sophisticated visual language whose meaning died with the people who created it. The Pictish language presents similar problems. Very few examples of written Pictish survive. A handful of inscriptions, some in the Ogham script borrowed from Irish tradition, provide fragments of vocabulary. Place names across northeastern Scotland preserve what appear to be Pictish words. The linguistic evidence, sparse as it is, has led most modern scholars to conclude that Pictish was a P-Celtic language related to Welsh, Cornish, and Cumbric, the Brythonic languages spoken across much of Britain before the Anglo-Saxon migrations. But for centuries, alternative theories persisted. Some scholars argued that Pictish was non-Indo-European, a survival of the pre-Celtic languages spoken in Britain before the arrival of Celtic peoples in the first millennium BC. Comparisons were drawn to Basque, the mysterious language isolate of the Pyrenees, suggesting that the Picts might represent a similar pre-Indo-European remnant in northern Britain. Others proposed that the Picts were not indigenous to Britain at all, that they had migrated from Scandinavia, from the continent, from some unknown origin that explained their apparent distinctiveness from the Celtic populations to their south. The uncertainty about Pictish origins reflected a broader uncertainty about Pictish identity. Were they fundamentally different from the other peoples of early medieval Britain? Or were they simply the northern continuation of the same Iron Age population that had inhabited the island for millennia? The historical sources offered tantalizing but contradictory hints. Bede, in his Ecclesiastical History, claimed that the Picts had originally arrived in Britain from Scythia, the vague term ancient and medieval writers used for the steppes of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. He reported that they had first landed in Ireland, been music directed to Britain by the Irish, and settled in the north when the southern portions of the island were already occupied. Bede also claimed that the Picts practiced matrilineal succession, tracing royal descent through the female line, a practice that he described as unique among the peoples of Britain. Both claims have been extensively debated. The Scythian origin story may be legendary rather than historical, a conventional migration narrative of the type that medieval writers routinely invented for the peoples they described. The matrilineal succession claim has been variously interpreted as accurate ethnographic observation, misunderstanding of specific dynastic situations, or rhetorical invention. The truth is that Bede, writing in Northumbria more than a century after many of the events he described, may not have known much more about Pictish origins than modern scholars do. The mystery persisted because the evidence was insufficient to resolve it until the DNA. The 2023 study was the product of years of collaboration among archaeologists, geneticists, and bioarchaeologists from multiple institutions. The skeletal material came from 2 primary sites. Lundin Links in Fife on Scotland's east coast is a long schist cemetery dating to approximately the 5th through 7th centuries AD. Long schists, stone-lined graves characteristic of early medieval Scotland, were the standard burial form for Pictish period populations in this region. The cemetery was excavated in the early 1990s, and the skeletal material was preserved for future analysis. The Black Isle, a peninsula in Easter Ross on the northeast coast, provided additional material from the Rosemarkie Cave excavation. The site contained burials from the same approximate period, including one individual, Rosemarkie Man, whose skeleton showed evidence of extensive blunt force trauma to the head. Rosemarkie Man had been killed violently and then carefully buried. The forensic evidence suggested either ritual killing or execution followed by formal interment, a pattern that raised questions about Pictish social practices that the archaeological record alone could not answer. The DNA extraction and sequencing were conducted using techniques refined over the past decade of ancient DNA research. The methodology was sophisticated. The researchers used imputed genomes, reconstructing missing sections of the ancient DNA using statistical methods calibrated against modern reference populations. They analyzed both autosomal DNA inherited from both parents and uniparental markers. Mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome data were used to build a comprehensive picture of Pictish genetic relationships. The results were compared against a database of ancient and modern genomes from across Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe. The question was simple: where did the Picts come from? The answer defied expectations. The Picts were not Scythian. They were not Scandinavian. They were not continental migrants of any kind. They were not, music in any meaningful genetic sense, distinct from the other peoples of Iron Age Britain. The genomes from London Links and the Black Isle showed that the Picts were most closely related to the Iron Age inhabitants of Britain, the populations who had lived on the island for millennia before the Roman conquest, music before the Anglo-Saxon migrations, before any of the historical events that medieval writers used to explain Pictish distinctiveness. Music. The Picts were indigenous. They were not mysterious invaders from distant lands. They were not survivors of a pre-Indo-European substrate. They were the direct descendants of the same Iron Age British population that had inhabited northeastern Scotland since long before the historical period began. The genetic data showed no evidence of major migration into Pictland during the period when Pictish culture emerged. The population was continuous. The culture was distinctive. But the people were the same people who had always been there. This finding resolved some questions and raised others. The theories of exotic Pictish origins, the Scythian migrations, music, the pre-Indo-European connections, the Scandinavian affinities, were definitively refuted. The Picts were genetically British. Their ancestors had lived in Britain for thousands of music years before the Pictish cultural complex emerged in the late Roman period. But if the Picts were genetically continuous with the Iron Age population of northern Britain, why did they develop such a distinctive culture? Why did they produce an artistic tradition, the symbol stones, that has no parallel elsewhere in Britain or Europe? Music. Why did they maintain a separate identity, a separate kingdom, a separate name for 6 centuries? The genetic evidence showed that Pictish distinctiveness was not biological. It was cultural. The symbols, the language, the political organization, the artistic traditions, these were the products of cultural development within an indigenous population, not the importation of foreign customs by migrant groups. The Picts were the same people as their Iron Age ancestors. They had simply developed a distinctive way of life that set them apart from their neighbors. The second major finding was equally significant. The disappearance of the Picts in the 9th century had long been interpreted in various ways. The traditional narrative associated with the figure Synaid mac Ailpin held that the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriata, based in western Scotland and closely connected to Ireland, had conquered or absorbed the Pictish kingdom around 843 Music AD. The resulting polity, the Kingdom of Alba, was Gaelic in language and culture. The Picts had been replaced, their language forgotten, their identity erased. Some versions of this narrative suggested actual population replacement. They argued that the Gaels had not merely conquered the Picts, but had displaced them through violence, forced movement, or demographic swamping. The DNA evidence contradicted this interpretation. The Picts had not been replaced. They had been assimilated. The 2023 study found that Pictish genetic signatures contributed substantially to the modern population of eastern and northern Scotland. The people living in these regions today are, in significant part, the biological descendants of the Picts. The culture disappeared. The people did not. The transition from Pictish to Scottish identity was a cultural transformation, not a population replacement. The Picts adopted Gaelic language and customs, intermarried with Gaelic populations, and eventually ceased to identify as a distinct group. Their genetic legacy persisted. Modern Scots, particularly those from the Eastern Highlands, Aberdeenshire, Fife, Music, and surrounding regions, carry Pictish ancestry. The Picts are not gone. They are still here, encoded in the DNA of their descendants. The study also revealed unexpected connections to other populations across the British Isles. Pictish genomes showed closest modern affinities to populations in Western Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Northumbria. Music regions that shared the Atlantic Britain genetic pattern characteristic of Western and Northern British populations, less affected by Anglo-Saxon and other continental migrations. This pattern suggested that the Picts were part of a broader British genetic continuum that extended down the western coast and into Wales and Ireland. The distinctiveness of Pictish culture did not reflect biological isolation. The Picts were connected, genetically and through trade, migration, and intermarriage, to populations across the British Isles. Their cultural distinctiveness emerged within this connected world, not in isolation from it. The implications for understanding Pictish history are profound. The symbol stones, the distinctive artistic tradition that has fascinated researchers for centuries, were not the product of exotic migrants bringing foreign customs to northern Britain. They were the creation of an indigenous population developing its own cultural vocabulary. The symbols emerged from within Pictish society, from whatever social, religious, or political pressures led this particular population to develop this particular form of visual expression. The question of what the symbols mean remains open, but the question of who created them has been answered. The Picts created them, and the Picts were the descendants of the Iron Age Britons music, who had lived in northeastern Scotland for millennia. The archaeological context supports the genetic findings. Gordon Noble, professor of archaeology at the University of Aberdeen and one of the co-authors of the 2023 study, has spent years investigating Pictish period sites across northeastern Scotland through the Northern Picts project. His excavations have revealed a sophisticated society, not the primitive barbarians of Roman propaganda, but a complex polity with substantial agricultural production, metalworking capabilities, and monumental architecture. The hill fort at Burghead, on the Moray coast, was one of the largest defensive sites in early medieval Britain. The carved bull stones found there demonstrate the same artistic sophistication visible in the symbol stones scattered across Pictland. The monastery at Port Mahomet, music excavated by Martin Carver of the University of York between 1994 and 2007, revealed a Christian community that produced high-quality metalwork and music parchment manuscripts from the 6th century onward. The Picts were not culturally backward. They were participants in the broader Christian and artistic traditions of early medieval Europe while maintaining distinctive regional characteristics that set them apart from their neighbors. The genetic evidence confirms what the archaeological evidence had suggested. The Picts were a sophisticated music indigenous population whose cultural distinctiveness emerged from internal development rather than external influence. The violent death of Rosemarkie Man adds another dimension to the picture. The skeletal evidence showed this individual had been killed by repeated blows to the head. At least 5 separate impacts were delivered with sufficient force to fracture the skull. The pattern suggested a deliberate killing, music, rather than death in battle. After death, the body was carefully buried in the cave. The combination of violent death and formal burial is music, difficult to interpret. Execution followed by respectful interment, ritual sacrifice, the killing of a high-status individual whose body still required proper treatment. The DNA analysis showed Rosemarkie man was genetically similar to the other Pictish individuals in the study. An ordinary member of the Pictish population, not a foreign captive or an outsider. Whatever happened to him, it happened within Pictish society to a member of that society. The violence was internal. The burial was deliberate. The meaning remains unknown. The 2023 study builds on a decade of revolutionary advances in ancient DNA research. The 2018 Olalde and others paper in Nature established the genetic framework for understanding British population history from the Bronze Age through the early medieval period. The 2022 Patterson and others paper in Nature documented significant continental European migration into Iron Age southern Britain. Against this background, the Pictish findings stand out. While southern Britain experienced substantial genetic turnover during the Anglo-Saxon period, with continental migrants contributing significantly to the modern English population, northeastern Scotland remained genetically stable. The Picts were insulated from the migrations that transformed southern Britain. Their genetic continuity reflects their political and geographic position north of the areas where Anglo-Saxon settlement was concentrated, protected by distance and by the military strength that allowed Music Pictish kings to maintain their independence. The Battle of Dun Nectain in 685 AD, when King Bride III Macbeli defeated the Northumbrian Anglo-Saxons under King Ecgfrith, marked the end of Northumbrian expansion into Pictland. The Pictish victory ensured that northeastern Scotland would not be absorbed into the Anglo-Saxon cultural and genetic sphere. The Aberlemno stones in Angus may commemorate this victory, and one of the carved stones appears to depict a battle scene that some scholars have interpreted as representing Dun Nectain. The Pictish kingdom survived for another century and a half after this victory, maintaining its independence until the gradual absorption into the kingdom of Alba in the 9th century. Throughout this period, the population remained genetically stable. The people who carved the symbol stones, who built the hill forts, who founded the monasteries, they were the same population that had inhabited this land since the Iron Age. The discoveries reached far beyond the story of the Picts themselves. They demonstrated how modern genetic science is transforming our understanding of history. For generations, historians relied on scattered manuscripts, weathered monuments, and incomplete archaeological discoveries to explain the past. Those clues were valuable, but they often left room for competing interpretations. Ancient DNA is changing that by providing evidence that comes directly from the people who actually lived through history. For more than 200 years, researchers argued over where the Picts had originated. Some believed they were newcomers who arrived from distant lands, while others suggested they belonged to an ancient civilization that predated the Celtic world. Medieval writings offered only brief references. Their carved symbols remained undeciphered, and surviving linguistic evidence was too limited to settle the debate. Every new theory raised fresh questions, but none could be proven with certainty. The genetic evidence changed everything. Instead of pointing to a foreign migration or a mysterious lost race, the DNA showed remarkable continuity with the Iron Age communities already living in northeastern Britain. The Picts were not outsiders establishing a new homeland. They were local people whose society gradually evolved into a unique and powerful culture over many centuries. This breakthrough represents much more than a solution to one historical mystery. It highlights a wider revolution taking place in archaeology. Scientists are now using ancient DNA to re-examine some of Europe's biggest unanswered questions, including the movement of Anglo-Saxon populations, the long-term influence of Viking settlements, and the ancestry of communities across Ireland, Wales, and Britain. In many cases, genetic evidence has confirmed old ideas, while in others it has forced historians to rethink assumptions that had been accepted for decades. Unlike many civilizations, the Picts left almost no written record describing their own history. They never explained their origins, their identity, or the meaning behind the symbols carved into their famous stones. Yet the evidence survived in another form. Hidden within their ancient remains was a biological record that endured for over 1,000 years, waiting for technology advanced enough to read it. Their monuments continue to stand as reminders of that remarkable civilization. Magnificent carved stones display scenes of hunting, warriors, noble families, intricate knotwork, and mysterious symbols whose meanings remain unknown. These monuments reveal extraordinary artistic skill and a society capable of producing lasting works of craftsmanship, but they also tell a quieter story. The people who created them were not foreign conquerors. They belonged to communities whose ancestors had lived in the region for generations. Some of the tallest and most impressive stones appear to commemorate great battles and political change during the final years of the Pictish kingdom. Those events were not the destruction of one people by another. Instead, they marked a gradual transformation. As new kingdoms emerged, the Picts were absorbed into a larger political identity, eventually becoming part of the Kingdom of Alba, the foundation of medieval Scotland. Many mysteries still remain. Researchers have yet to fully understand the Pictish language. Their unusual carved symbols continue to resist interpretation, and much of their political system must still be reconstructed from outside sources. Even so, the most important question has finally received a convincing answer. The Picts were the indigenous inhabitants of northeastern Scotland, descended from Iron Age Britons, whose culture developed along its own distinctive path for nearly 600 years. Their separate identity eventually blended into the growing Scottish nation, but the people themselves did not disappear. Today, their carved stones still rise across the Scottish landscape, standing in fields, villages, and ancient sites as silent witnesses to a forgotten age. The symbols they engraved continue to challenge scholars, yet the people behind those symbols are no longer hidden by mystery. Modern genetics has revealed what centuries of speculation could not. The Picts never truly vanished. Their identity changed, their kingdom faded, but their descendants remain part of Scotland to this very day.